Hi guys, so this is part 2 of the whole Woodrow Wilson presidency thing that I'm doing right now. So make sure to watch part 1 to be up to date and understand what's going on. Now, as I promised you guys in the last video, we're gonna talk about World War One today. Now, I'm sure you guys have some sort of idea of how America entered that war. Something that goes like this.
Fuck yeah! Coming again to save the motherfucking day, yeah, America!
Well, in reality, things are much more complicated than that. To understand it better, let's talk about the war itself a little bit. So in the 1910s, tensions in Europe were very high, and with the alliances that were forming, a huge war was looking very likely. But where would it start? The answer to that question is the Balkans. Nationalist movements were popular all around Habsburg, Austria-Hungary. In particular, some Serbs and Bosnians living here wanted to become part of Serbia. So it's of course expected that if a member of the Austrian royal family visited the region, they would try to kill him. And that's exactly what happened to Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Austria-Hungary was of course very angry. They blamed Serbia for the assassination, and they started thinking about invading. However, they knew that Serbia's mom, Russia, would get involved if any invasion were to happen. So Austria-Hungary went to their mom, Germany, and asked them to help out in case Russia gets involved. Germany was like, okay, go ahead. So then the four countries quickly declare war on each other. For now, Germany was trying to find a way to win the war quickly. Don't worry guys, I have a plan. Since Russia and France are really good friends, France will definitely join the war. Luckily for us, Russia is very big, so it'll take them a while to mobilize. Let's attack France first, beat them up quickly, then move our troops to Russia and beat them also, and then Europe will be fully German and our destiny will be fulfilled. Now there was a bit of a problem with the plan. France figured out what was going on, so they mobilized and started defending the border, which means Germany had to go around their defenses through Belgium. However, Belgium's mom is Britain, so they entered the war too. As they were invading Belgium, Germans committed some horrific atrocities, and the British had a field day with all the propaganda that quickly spread around the world, particularly in America. Now you may be wondering what Wilson's reaction to these events was. At first, he tried to convince everyone to stop fighting, but that went just about as you'd expect, so he now strongly expressed the neutrality of America. Though he personally sided with the Triple Entente, he wanted nothing to do with the conflict, but he had his own weird reasons for doing so. He believed that America was just too proud to fight, that America was above being involved in these squabbles between the childish Europeans. Now back in Europe, Russia is ready for war, earlier than the Germans expected, and Austria doesn't do a great job at stopping them. So Germany now has to send troops from the west to help fight Russia, which meant that the Western Front quickly became a stalemate. In order to get an advantage, both sides started to get new allies. Italy and Japan joined the Entente, and the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. Okay, I have to tell you how the Ottomans entered that war. I mean, the story is just too funny, I can't not say it. So in Istanbul, no one could agree on whether they should get involved in the war. One guy who wanted to join Germany's side was Enver Pasha, and he had an idea. He bought a German warship, dressed the Germans in it with Ottoman clothing, and then told them to attack Russia. And they were like, okay. Then Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire after the attack. Enver then came back and was like, whoops, I guess we have to go to war now. Back in America, Wilson is still proclaiming his neutrality in the conflict, in thought as well as action. And he stayed true to this by allowing weapons sales to significantly favor the Entente. This was terrible news for Germany, who quickly realized that if a stalemate continued, they were doomed to lose, since they didn't have as much resources as their enemies did. They needed new ideas, so they started to use chemical weapons, Zeppelin air raids on civilians, and most crucially, they started a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare as a response to the British blockade. And in May 1915, the Germans torpedoed a civilian ship, the RMS Lusitania. This led to the deaths of over 1,000 people, including 128 Americans. As a result of this, American public opinion became very anti-German, though people still wanted to stay out of the war. Wilson was pissed at the sinking, and he secretly started allowing loans to be sent to the warring nations. These loans clearly favored the Entente heavily, but Wilson still kept publicly showing himself as neutral. The Germans eventually stopped their submarine warfare so as to not provoke the Americans, who clearly were on one side and not the other. It's now 1916, and an election is coming. The Republicans are still not doing too well, and they nominate Charles Evans Hughes, who wasn't really the best of candidates. As for the Progressives, they try to nominate Roosevelt again, but he refuses because he learned from last time and really just wanted Wilson to lose. So we only have two candidates now, Wilson and Hughes. In this election, the Democratic campaign made sure to point out the fact that Wilson didn't join the war, as their slogan was, "He kept us out of war," implying that he will continue to keep us out of war after being elected, a claim that definitely aged very well. Wilson ended up winning the election, though it was a really close one. Now back to the war. In January 1917, the situation was, again, becoming pretty bad for the Germans. This pushed Kaiser Wilhelm I and last to initiate another policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. Now the Germans, they knew that such plans would definitely provoke American involvement in the war, so they needed a new ally, possibly one close to the United States, to keep them preoccupied. Okay, you get it, it's Mexico. The German Minister of Foreign Affairs, Arthur Zimmermann, sent an encoded telegram to the Mexican government, basically telling them, "Yo, could you like invade America? We'll help you out, just don't worry." Mexico, because they had a brain, said, "No thanks, we're good." So the problem here was that the telegram was intercepted by the British, who then showed it to Wilson. "Yo, Willie, check this out. We have the freshest gossip in the world." Literally. "Okay, let me see." "Wow, that's crazy, dude." "Yeah, so will you join us in the war, please?" "Wait a second. How do we know it's actually Germany who sent the telegram?" "Oh, don't worry about that, it's us." It took Wilson about 2 months to think about it, during which many American ships were being sunk. And in April 1917, Wilson pleaded with Congress to declare war on Germany. Now, this was weird for the guy who, for a long time, had been all about neutrality, which means he needed a solid argument to convince Congress to enter the war. Wilson framed the war as a crusade for peace, one that would make the world safe for democracy, and he called it the war to end all wars, which, as you know, didn't quite work out. Anyway, the entrance of the US was crucial to breaking the stalemate in Europe. It gave the Entente an almost unlimited supply of men they could use to win the war. The war would continue for about a year and a half, until the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918. Now, the US did help out, and that's all well and good, but what happened inside the US during the time they were at war is also very important. Wilson knew that there was a significant number of people who weren't fans of America joining in, even after the Zimmermann telegram. So he proceeded to engage in an intense propaganda campaign that tried to promote patriotism and anti-German sentiment. Now, all of this was pretty typical in a warring nation, but Wilson took it a step further. He started by naming German Americans as enemy aliens, something that would justify their internment throughout the war. He also pushed for the passage of the Espionage Act of 1917, which would, among other things, prosecute anyone who said the war was wrong. Of course, this violated that little thing called the First Amendment, so the Supreme Court naturally should just strike it down. Right, guys? Right? Right? Well, they surprisingly didn't, and they even justified its constitutionality by saying that such speech obstructed the recruitment of soldiers. Yeah. This act, by the way, is still in effect, and many have been prosecuted under it in recent years, though it's not as bad as it used to be. Now, you may think the Espionage Act was created because of the war, but that is not true. The war was only the excuse. The act was actually asked for in 1915 by Wilson himself, 2 years before America would join the war. He wanted to use it as a way to fight against immigrant Americans, who Wilson saw as disloyal by nature. As if this wasn't enough, Wilson pushed for the enactment of the Sedition Act of 1918, which was just a bunch of amendments to the Espionage Act that made it even worse. I'll put the text on the screen for those who are interested. Like, this is seriously stuff you see in dictatorships. It's that bad. The Sedition Act would stay in effect until 1920, way after the war had ended, which shows you the real reasons why the act was made. Thousands were prosecuted under these two acts, including our old socialist friend Eugene Debs, who was sentenced to 10 years in prison for giving a speech where he criticized American involvement in the war. He only served 3 years and ended up having to run for president in 1920 from prison. What a guy. So in early 1918, Wilson gave a speech where he outlined America's goals during the war. He articulated 14 points. These ones. Feel free to read them. They all sound good, but some of them are dog whistles, so let me correct them quickly. Alright, that's better. A chance to apply these 14 points in practice came almost immediately after this speech was given, and it had to do with Russia. Now, the country had been embroiled in revolution around the time America entered the war. The people were starving, and they wanted Russia to leave the war. In March 1917, a revolution forced Tsar Nicholas to abdicate, and a provisional government was established. But then these guys just didn't leave the war, so in November 1917, the aptly named October Revolution happened and the Bolsheviks took power. Lenin, of course, immediately pulled out of the war. As you can imagine, this pissed off the Allies for a number of reasons. First, the Germans no longer had to fight in the east, which means they could concentrate more troops in the west. And second, the weapons that were given to Russia before can't be used in the war effort anymore, and with civil war starting in Russia, they were in danger of being seized by the Germans. This led some of the Allies, most notably Britain and France, to start thinking about intervening in Russia in an effort to stop these things from happening and also reopening an eastern offensive against Germany. Now, it was time for Wilson to show the Allies that this was a terrible idea, because he obviously should have learned from his mistakes in Mexico by now. And he did so by sending thousands of troops to Russia? Whoa there. Wait a second. Go back. Further. 14 points. What's point 6? Oh, don't fuck with Russia, eh? I guess that one just doesn't matter, right, Wilson? But anyways, the Allies basically just invaded the Soviet Union, and at some points during the intervention, they held more Russian territories than the Bolsheviks themselves. The bloodiest of the battles fought between the Allies and the Bolsheviks in
Архангельская область
was one that happened on the day of the World War I armistice, which is ironically called Peace Day's Bloody Battle. This invasion was a failure. It didn't do much to secure the Eastern Front, and continued long after World War I had ended, when it became pointless and none of the soldiers or their commanders knew what the hell they were still doing in Russia. The Allies did, however, get the weapons they wanted to secure, but proceeded to just leave them there after the intervention ended in 1920. The intervention in the end turned out to be just completely pointless, and the Allies couldn't achieve any of their initial goals. Now, some of you may point out that maybe they did all of this to just defeat communism, but that doesn't hold any weight, because one of the opposition movements they supported was Menshevik, and the Mensheviks were also communists. This was just a total blunder on the part of the Allies, and the intervention ended up being much more significant than they thought initially. In many ways, the Cold War started right here. American and Soviet relations were very bad from the beginning, and it was mostly because of this intervention, which set the stage for future hostilities between the two nations. Inside America, fear of communism boiled over into becoming the first Red Scare in 1919. But that's a topic that will be covered in the next video. Yes, there's a part 3 coming, and boy do we still have a lot to talk about. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Peace.
Wilson, that's all. Wilson, that's all. Who strikes the blow?